So what we're going to talk about is really climate, but also in a very personal way, where we live and how we live. And since I'm not a lawyer, I'm going to violate the first rule of being a lawyer, which is to ask a question that I don't know the answer to. How many of you got here by some means other than driving a car by yourself? So we're going to say 15%, 20%. Not bad, not bad. But what I'm going to talk about, and actually before I do this, Shannon suggested I mention to you a little bit about the Conservation League. And the Conservation League was founded 26 years ago. We are focused on trying to promote better patterns of development. We're trying to protect rural land. We're trying to promote energy policies that are more responsible, renewable energy and efficiency. And we have an agriculture program which we launched Grow Food Carolina through. Some of y'all may have seen the Grow Food building on Morrison, the mural. And we sell to over 100, Grow Food does, to over 100 restaurants and grocery stores in Charleston. And Grow Food is growing every year. The point of that was to provide farmers an opportunity to market their produce locally, especially ones who were smaller and mid-sized, who didn't have access to big markets, because we felt like protecting this landscape of Johns Island and Edisto and Wadmalaw and McClellanville and Awandale really required that there be an economic use for the land, beyond just having wealthy people put easements on property, which has been very successful here. Ordinary people should be able to grow food on their land and not have to sell to developers. Kind of a simple concept, but it's so far been very successful. I want to just have the staff who are here stand up, and I'll introduce them just to let you know who some of the people who work for us. Give them a big hand. We got Shannon Smith, Natalie Olson, Ellie Bonstein, and Lauren Manning. And if y'all have questions about the league, they can probably answer them afterwards. So one of the things we worked on early on was the issue of not only where should we grow and where should we not grow, but how should we grow? What patterns of growth and development are ones that are the most sustainable in the long term? And we found out a lot of interesting stuff. I grew up in the suburbs of Columbia. My worldview was basically getting in a car, driving to school, getting in a car, driving to the mall, or getting in a car and driving to my friend's house. And so that was kind of the way I, in the 1960s and 70s, experienced the world. And what I realized, and what we realized after looking into this question of what makes cities functional, what makes them great, what makes them enjoyable, is that there are some profound implications, not only for climate and the environment, but also just for our lives and our experiences of the issue of urban design, how our cities are laid out. Now, we are here, the magic of Google Earth, Street View. We're right here, and you can see a few distinctive characteristics of this city. This is a 300-year-old city with a fairly narrow road, formerly two ways, now one, fairly wide sidewalks, people walking, street trees, buildings brought right up to the street, distinctive architecture. All of these things are a function of a particular urban design that some people call urbanism or traditional neighborhood design. When you look at it from the air, you can really have an even better sense of how things work. The Library Society is right here. And of course, this is King and Jacobs Alley and Madison and Nellie went to school right over here at Charleston Day. And they were able, or Nellie was able to walk to school, and Madison, when she stayed with her friends downtown, even though she was living in Mount Pleasant, was able to walk to school. There are houses within proximity, easy walking distance of places to shop and to work, offices on King Street, institutions like the Library Society, the courthouse over here, parks over at the Battery. And so this is a very intricately complex fabric of land uses that are all interspersed and blended together in a way that is not only functional, which allows people easy access to destinations, but also quite beautiful and desirable. People want to live in places like this. And, excuse me, that was not something that people in Charleston 300 years ago decided to do, just to lay it out this way. They had to lay cities out like this because people did not have easy access to mobility. You know, they couldn't drive 35 miles an hour. They had to walk or take a carriage. Or even actually in the early part of the 20th century in Charleston, they could take a trolley car. And so we had light rail. This is not actually Charleston, you probably know. But we had a trolley car in downtown Charleston. But what you see here, it's sort of encroaching on this picture, is this phenomenon right here. And as Henry Ford geared up the mass production of automobiles, things began to change. Not only did people begin to have access to petroleum-based transit, but families began to look at life in different ways. This is a Firebird, by the way, Pontiac. You know, in the 50s, this Corvette, didn't get the analogy so much. Sack full of jackrabbits, I guess back then you would have understood what that meant. Simultaneously, and in response to this new phenomenon of the automobile, came the good roads movement, beginning in the early 1900s and culminating in this explosive intensity in the 50s with the creation of the interstate highway system, signed by Dwight D. Eisenhower, the law was, in the 1950s. And with that, cities underwent a radical transformation. Instead of the kind of road system, transportation network that we just saw and that we see out here, people began to think of roads to accommodate cars. All of a sudden, cars became the primary target of our affection, of our lifestyle, and roads had to first and foremost, and cities had to first and foremost make cars happy. And so roads became wider, the curves became more sweeping. You didn't have to stop if you didn't want to in this new phenomenon called the cloverleaf, and cars were accommodated in the most glorious and abundant way imaginable. Now, what did all this add up to over the course of really 5 to 7 decades? Well, cities began to look more like this. This is Citadel Mall. This is the Mark Clark Expressway. And this is Highway 17, and y'all know this well. Now, the city of Charleston just had a big event out here and said, this is the new center of the city of Charleston. We want to do something to renovate and revitalize it. And so, what exactly is going on here that was different? Well, first of all, obviously, the road system is quite different. You know, this is not King Street anymore. This is a 55, 65 mile an hour freeway that you gain access to this commercial site, and it's only commercial. There's no housing here. This is an enormous footprint, really. It would cover much of the South of Broad. The housing is sequestered over here. The roads, actually, and this is important, are differently laid out. We saw in that earlier image a grid of streets, and cities were built on grids beginning as far back as the classical Greek era. Those were the first gridded streets because they were the most efficient way to lay streets out. But no more do we have grids of streets. We have dead ends, we have cul-de-sacs, we have strange forms that begin to take on a different functional component. We also have strips of commercial development along the main road. And, you know, again, houses not so much integrated here, and certainly not in a way that one could walk pretty much anywhere except maybe next door. And this is what the new landscape began to look like. This is a landscape, again, that is very accommodating to cars, not so much to people. People are less happy here, I think we could argue, and this sidewalk, which doesn't have anybody on it, just because when Google Earth was out driving around taking pictures, there was nobody on it, because there's almost never anyone on it. You can imagine that if someone were on here, you would look at this person with pity. You would wonder whether his car had broken down, whether he had a car. The sidewalks are really not even present in a lot of these major arterials, but even where they are, they're not very useful. The second thing that's going on here is that the city, the architecture is changing. Unlike the intricate and really complicated and unique architectural details that you see in cities like this, that you can see when you walk and stop, because you can stop, we have now what is called franchise architecture that has to be accessible and understandable through a windshield at the speed of about 35 miles an hour. If you're lucky, if you're in a traffic jam, you have more time. So this is the change of visually to the aesthetic landscape that is a function of the new system of transportation. Now, this is what we commonly call urban sprawl, and most people don't like it. They don't really know what the alternatives are, but we say often we don't want urban sprawl. We don't want to look like Atlanta or Charlotte. But what I felt was important to do was to identify specifically what are the problems. Let's be sort of rigorous here about it and say what actually how do these new city forms change the way we operate and the way we use resources? Well, first of all, and the most obvious, is traffic congestion. You know, we now are facing hours, in some cases, in some cities, hour commute times in California, in New York, in Charlotte, in Atlanta, because of the increasing inability to move people from where they live to where they work. That's the most basic thing, and this, of course, is our own I-26. We think, well, let's just do more of what we did before. How do we make cars move more easily and make them happier? Well, we'll add another lane to the interstate. And this is tolls, of course, with the interstate center right here and one lane going that way. And they say, well, traffic still doesn't seem to be moving, but if we add Canada and Mexico, we could add a few more lanes in each direction. And the bottom line here is that adding lanes just doesn't work. There's a phenomenon called induced traffic, and every time we add a lane, we get more use and more development further out. Well, of course, too, sprawl reduces our landscape to what formerly was an indigenous landscape of farms and forests and wetlands and wildlife habitat to subdivisions and strip malls at a rate, and this is important, not just at the rate of population growth, but a rate that is many times faster than population growth. We're chewing up the landscape at 5, 6, 7, or even 10 times the rate of population growth. Animals don't do so well. This is a New York City squirrel here. It's a normal, so this is a normal squirrel. Now, how actually much land are we using? And that was a big question. I think we all have our own point of reference. It's like looking at the elephant. I know this piece and you know that piece. There's the tail here, the trunk here. But how do we put it all together? Well, this is our region, the one that we all call home, bounded by the Santee River on the north, the Edisto on the west, and then the ocean. And here, the red is what was developed land in 1985. It was about 45,000 acres of land, and it was it represented 300 years of growth. All of the people who had moved here and lived here over 300 years lived on 45,000 acres. They lived in Mount Pleasant, on Sullivan's, Isle of Palms, west of the Ashley James Island, and some people in Somerville. 20 years later, that area had grown by 250%. This is the explosion that occurred, I-26, 95, some of the big interstates really coming online, and their impacts being realized. Somerville really exploding, Mount Pleasant taking off, and I'm sure y'all know this story, going out, up toward McClellanville, and also Johns Island even getting some development. So we went to Clemson Strom Thurmond Institute, and we wanted to know, based on that pattern of growth, what should we expect in 30 years? What would things be like 30 years from now? We had a pretty good idea of how many people were going to be here, but we asked Clemson where they would be likely to live and what amount of land they would take up. And this was their projection. Now, this means that the Ashley River Historic Corridor would have been developed, Johns Island would have been developed, and development would have run up 17 to McClellanville almost. And this is a 2030 projection. The good news, and I'm not going to talk so much about the the rural land side of this today, but the good news is that at the same time, there was a new conservation effort going on starting in the 80s, the Ace Basin, and tremendous progress was made and is being made today to avoid this future. There are two futures. One is the one that we do nothing, we do the same thing we've done, and the other is the one that we intervene. And the one that we have chosen, fortunately, is one that we intervene in. Air and water pollution, runoff from parking lots, the single biggest source of pollution in America is runoff. In impoverished civic life, maybe a little bit harder to tell, but again, here's the franchise architecture. This is Folly Road. Each one of these things, there's nothing subtle about any of this. There's nothing indigenous about it. There's nothing historic about it. It has to be something that can be apprehended and understood in a split second from a windshield. Higher taxes, something quite a little bit less well known. But taxes go up when we spread out because we have to provide more services more inefficiently. Reduced housing choices. Well, you can have a house that looks like that, or that, or that, or that, and they all look pretty much the same. This is actually kind of one of the earlier examples, Levittown. And so the model, the paradigm shifted from complexity, different options, to one that was pretty much all the same. And the market actually wasn't even the main driver. Zoning became the driver of how development occurred. How large was the lot? Was it a single family lot? Could it be next to a store or not? And the answer was no, always. This is another, my favorite cartoonist, Toll. Eventually, the two met. Los Angeles suburb runs into the suburb of New York in the middle, somewhere around Salina, Kansas. But what exactly is sprawl? Now, if you probably subscribe, as most of us do, to the Potter Stewart definition, as he said, of pornography. I don't really know exactly how to describe it, but I know it when I see it. Well, we know it when we see it, but I'm going to try to describe it. It's urban development in the wrong place. The wrong place. It shouldn't be on farms and forests, far away from existing homes, offices, and schools. And urban development in the wrong patterns, on branching street systems, all feeding into these large arterial roads that feed into even larger arterial roads, along strip development, single-use pods, wastefully low land-devouring density. This happens to be Mount Pleasant, but unfortunately there are too many examples like this. A single entry and exit, all houses onto Rifle Range Road, and you can imagine what this does for traffic. It concentrates the flow of traffic to one point every morning and every afternoon. Smart growth, the opposite of sprawl, and here's the solution. This sounds like a depressing talk, but it actually is not, because there's a solution that we are actively and can actively implement, and that is growth focused in areas where there's already development, infill sites in existing communities, and organized in traditional patterns. We know how to do it. We've done it for over 2,000 years. We just had a temporary lapse of memory around 1950. With houses and stores all integrated together, blended together on small roads that allow people to walk and bike as well, and skateboard. And this is actually what it might look like if you were to say, what does it look like? You can see all of the elements here. There's a beautiful park. You've got institutional buildings, the port. You have industrial uses. There's Colonial Lake over here. Broad Street, we're right here somewhere. So it all works beautifully together. Charleston has 35,000 people who live downtown and 4 million tourists a year, and it works pretty well. There is some congestion, but things are not shut down. The benefits are opportunity and choice. Don't we all want that in America? We want to be able to choose what housing option that we live in. We don't want to just be given one option. And we want to be able to choose to walk or bike when we can. Not today, probably, but when it's a little bit warmer, which it will be tomorrow. And in the process, we've got a lot of what we call collateral benefits. We save the environment. People are healthier. Air quality is healthier. We save money. These are all the benefits that come with smart growth and anti-sprawl policies. Now, I'll show you how does this stuff really work at a fine grain. This happens to be in Berkeley County near Otranto, and I used this slide for years, and then actually it got transferred to other people who have used it, including some pretty well-known civic designers. But if you lived in this house and you worked, this is on Highway 52, let's say you work in North Charleston, you come home, I forgot to buy a loaf of bread. My wife told me to buy it, I forgot to buy it. Well, it so happens that there's a store right here you can buy a loaf of bread. Well, the logical thing to do would be to walk out your back door and then walk over and buy the loaf of bread and walk back about 150 feet. But you can't do that because here is a fence, a railroad track, which you could walk across, but you'd have to maybe walk across your neighbor's yard who has a particularly vicious dog. So instead, you get in your car and you drive this way, off the chart to another road, a bigger road, and then another road over here across Mr. Rivers' face down here, and then you come out to Stokes Honda, and you take a left, and then you do a U-turn, pull in, buy your loaf of bread, drive back, and you've driven 2.5 miles round trip. And so we shouldn't wonder why vehicle miles traveled in America has skyrocketed. And with vehicle miles traveled, so has energy consumption skyrocketed. And with vehicle miles traveled, so has our experience of life plummeted because it's better to be at home with your family. Most people would say, some people wouldn't agree with that, but than it is to be in your car. Now, there are some subtle things. This actually is a group of 3 young folks who are actually not so young now. This is an old picture, but Madison knows them, who were walking to Charleston Day. And so we asked the question, what does this new paradigm of development have to do, or how does it affect children? Well, we looked at schools that were built after 1983 and those that were built before 1983, and we found out that because of the design, the location, and all of the attributes of our communities, that 4 times as many children can walk to schools that were built before 1983 as those that were built afterwards, for all the reasons that I just mentioned. Another example, this is the old village of Mount Pleasant, beloved. So it is so well liked that you cannot live there because it's too expensive. So you have to live on one of these things, which is less expensive, because it's not as nice. There's nothing really fundamentally worse about it. I mean, the houses are nice, they're probably bigger, they're newer, they're not as expensive to maintain, but it's not on a grid, and it's not as dense. And so in some ways, in the old version of this story would be, well, the lots are smaller, therefore the houses must be cheaper. Well, that's sort of exactly the opposite. When you go from the bigger lots that are less expensive to the somewhat smaller lots here, including dependency units, God forbid multifamily where criminals live, and then to downtown Charleston where there are a lot of people, it becomes more expensive every step you take. Except if you live at the beach at Sullivan's, it's a sort of an outlier. This is Savannah, and again, this is the most rigorous of all grids. It's a hard right angle grid. These people were not joking around when they laid this thing out. Charleston's grid, Andres Dewani called it a grid with an attitude. It's sort of bent, you know, if you go down New Street, you have to kind of go off to the right a little bit. But Savannah is the classic grid with wonderful squares, you know, as y'all are well aware, and along the river, and basically Savannah's a great place. Now, the same scale, it was built in around 1700 and over the course of about 200 years. The same scale, just remember that, for this next picture is Atlanta. This is up near Norcross, and you can see there is a completely different thing going on here. You've got streets that end at cul-de-sac dead ends. The density of the streets is dramatically less than Savannah, and everybody in Savannah lives in their cars. So the houses are nice, but everybody lives in their cars. Now, I'm going to quickly wind this up because I know y'all have to go to work, but this is a kind of neat thing. It's about options for transportation. And really, at some level, our most fundamental question that we have to answer as human beings on Earth is how do we get from point A to point B? You know, we ask that question every day. We don't think we're asking it. We sort of do it reflexively. But if we were to ask that question in a very rigorous way every day, this is the kind of analysis we would do. Okay, well, first you got one choice if you have one road. And let's just say this is somewhere in Mount Pleasant. But if you add another road, a crossroad, you get 2 choices. Now, another group, you've got a whole bunch more choices. And this number, how many of y'all were math majors? No math majors. Well, y'all were all art majors, right? So, but anyway, this is called a factorial equation, and it's kind of like exponential. It gets a lot bigger as you add a few more roads. So over time, when you build a grid of streets, you end up with many, many different travel options, and it could look like Beaufort. This is Beaufort. Now, some people have said, well, this stuff is just old. You know, these are old cities. We don't build them like that anymore. We can't build them like that anymore. For some reason, maybe the American psyche has changed. The builders don't do this stuff. Maybe they have different neurological connections or whatever. But the truth is we can build them like this. And we have built some new developments like this. Ion is one example. This one's brand new, circa, 1995 or so. And it has a grid of streets. It has squares. It has some density to the extent that Mount Pleasant would allow it. And it's great. But it's unaffordable. This is a market phenomenon. The better places become unaffordable. And so the market solution is, let's build everything great. Everything should be built in the same pattern, these patterns that have worked for 2 millennia, with the grids of streets, integrated uses. In fact, what I'd call the 7 habits of highly historic cities. Sidewalks that people actually use. A grid of streets, parks, mixed uses, densities, and centers, places that people can go and work. Now, there was a 7th habit here. Oh, it was edges. For some reason, this slide is not showing my whole slide, but it's edges, a green belt, because a great region is not only has great cities. If y'all have been to Europe, you've gone to the towns, you drive through the town, you're out of the town, and then you're in the countryside. And there's a sharp division between the town and the country in Europe, in most places, not in Italy. But that is the construction of it in its entirety of a great region, a place that's great to live in, an urban area, places where farming and forestry can go on, and places where people can hike and walk. That's the great region. This is just a quick thing, as a group called Smart Growth America that ranks how we're doing based on centers and density and street networks and connectivity. And out of 221, the top 5 most sprawling, 4 of the top 5 most sprawling metropolitan regions in America are in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Tennessee. And maybe no big surprise, because that's really where a lot of the growth has been, the more recent growth. Interestingly, New York is no big surprise, one of the densest and most functional. San Francisco is second. Madison, not Miller, but Wisconsin, is 13th. Eugene, Oregon. And then where the places really are sprawling out are places like Hickory, Lenore, Morganton. These are the places with many names. There's no more Durham. When I was growing up, you go to Durham. Now you go to Raleigh-Durham. And increasingly, Greenville-Spartanburg. Places that become jammed together and their names get jammed together. So the multi-name places are the ones you should worry about. Charleston so far still about in the middle. Well, not quite. We're in the lower half, but we're not as bad as Myrtle Beach or Asheville. Even though we love downtown Asheville, it's sprawling out. Charlotte, Columbia is not so good. So the point is that we can make the choice. In the same way we decide how to use energy at home, we can decide, it's a little more complicated, how we should grow. And we can involve ourselves in planning exercises, public meetings like 2 nights ago with the Sergeant Jasper. And if you really want to hear more about this, or learn more about it, or have your say on it actually, we have on Monday a forum on the vision for the next mayoral administration in Charleston. And this is a really important vote, as y'all well know. We've got 5 or 6 candidates now, and we'll be not listening to them tell us what is important. We've got people who've been involved in this stuff for years and decades, all presenting on what they believe to be some of the most important things that the new administration can take on to make Charleston remain the great place that it is, and over time, perhaps become even better. Thank you very much.
A quick weird thank you from MailChimp. We're giving you the knit MailChimp hat. The prize is you have to be the amazing speaker. So yes, this is epic.
I feel like Pac-Man.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us. We'll have just a moment of questions, and then we're short on time, so we're going to go ahead and let you guys go. I guess my quick question, I'll start it off, is how hopeful are you in Charleston catching on to this? Or what do you believe for the future of Charleston? Do you believe that this is feasible and that this is in the works and that that Charleston's ready for it, I guess?
Well, we're halfway there. You would think living in one of the great, y'all are not going to take me seriously with this thing on. So, anyway, I'll try to make serious points here. Charleston, you would think, is one of the most admired cities in America. It is. Number one, Condé Nast Traveler in America. Number two, in the world. Second behind Florence, not South Carolina, but Italy. And so, in spite of the fact that Lauren is from near Florence, Florence is not quite as great as Florence, Italy. So, but you would think that people would look at this city and say, of course, everyone wants to live here. I mean, we literally have too many people who want to live here. Therefore, we should figure out why it works and build things like it. New development. That's not what happened. For 30 years, 40 years, the zoning code for Charleston did not allow Charleston to be built anywhere else on James Island. The result of that zoning code is Folly Road. Everything that was built on James Island, we moved here 30 years ago, everything that was built out there was built according to the City of Charleston zoning code, which made illegal everything in downtown Charleston. The size of the lots, they were too small. The buildings close to the street. The roads, of course, could never be this narrow. They had to be much wider because they wanted cars to move freely and happily, which doesn't happen anyway, but the wrong motivation. So you would think that Charleston was such a great model that at least the city of Charleston itself would figure out how to build great places, but it didn't. But they are now trying to change that, and the city planning department has adopted these things called gathering places, and so has Mount Pleasant. And the problem is it's only half of the picture. You've got some density, but you don't have the connections, you don't have transit, you don't have the bike lanes on Maybank Highway, for example. There's not even a crosswalk or a light at the boulevard in Mount Pleasant. I mean, there's some other things. The architecture is terrible. But there should, it's amazing to me to go past the boulevard on Coleman Boulevard and see people running across the road in fear of their lives. I mean, how could that happen? They just need a stoplight there. So the details are critically important, but we're getting it, and we just need to really gear up. We should never, allow cities just to go as we have for the last 30 years without that kind of attention to detail and function.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yes.
I can't afford to live in Ion or off Broad Street so what is your suggestion? And a lot of us are kind of at that age too. So what is your suggestion for us in terms of where we decide to live?
Well, that is such an important question, and the point was that most people, and not just younger people, but people in general, cannot afford to live in Ion or downtown Charleston. Sullivan's, by the way, has a very nice grid, bigger lots, but nice grid. Some of the same components, nice grid, commercial integrated into residential. So the first thing is we need to allow these places to be replicated everywhere, even with smaller houses, more affordable houses, multifamily places that are appropriate for people at a particular stage in their lives. The other thing I would say, and we're seeing it now, and sort of it's a double-edged sword, but the movement up the peninsula obviously Wagner Terrace, but also to the east side is really rapid. I mean, it seems, you know, it takes a while to rebuild and restore some of these dilapidated areas. But then, of course, you face this issue of gentrification. And so over time, places that have had that happen have seen housing prices go up, and some people have been forced out. There are ways, and not to get into a whole nother subject, but there are ways to maintain a level of housing affordability that do not include crappy neighborhoods. A good blight and ruin is not a good affordable housing strategy. That has been our strategy here because that's where poor people live. And yet, if we, again, one, more volume in the market, you know, I'm a kind of, at that level, I'm a capitalist. You provide more of the product that people want by changing the zoning codes, eliminating the subsidies for sprawl, and one of the biggest ones, just by the way, would be the extension of 526 to Johns Island, you know, a 1970s idea that would really bring great devastation to that agricultural island by bringing an interstate to it. I mean, it's nuts. It's nuts. People in other cities, Milwaukee, Portland, Boston, are taking down these big arterial perimeter roads, elevated highways along the water. All the stuff that we built in the 60s and 70s, they're paying hundreds of millions of dollars to take it down. We are one of the few cities in America still thinking about and trying to build a perimeter road. And that is a disaster. But to your point, I think, again, the planning and zoning has got to change. I think it is. I mean, I think Mount Pleasant, frankly, with the boulevard, it's got a lot of problems, but at least they've got housing in the right place, and it's good. And this new proposal, Atlantic, is very large. Maybe it could be scaled down. Maybe the design can be changed right on Ben Sawyer. But the idea of having that kind of housing there is very important. People like, most people, again, it shouldn't be just for the wealthy.
All right, well, I think we'll probably go ahead and call it and let him get to work. But
All right.
thank you guys so much. If you have more questions, please come find Dana. He would love to talk, or some of the other people from the Conservation League. We'll see you guys on March 22nd at Coast and back here on the 27th. So thanks so much.